Coach, help, I'm losing. Didn't you say he has one piece? It's a knight. Hello and welcome. Today we are talking about 3 powerful patterns that will help you play against those tricky knights in the endgame. Thank you very much to Authentic Shift 5515 for this idea, and if you have any chess topic that you would like explained in very simple terms, feel free to drop a comment down below and I'll happily make a video on it. For now, enjoy this one and let's go. The first pattern you must know about is avoiding knight forks. How do we avoid knight forks? Very simple. We just have to realize that the knight as a piece is covering exclusively one color at a time. So when you have this kind of endgame where you have a king and a rook or a king and a queen or something like this against a knight, just keep those two very important pieces on opposite colors and you can never get forked by a knight again. This is particularly useful when you're in time trouble and you get a check like this. How do you know where to go? You have 3 options. You just take a look at your rook and you're like, okay, my rook is on a light square, so if I go to a dark square, I'm safe. And you don't even have to spend time on this. Of course, let's take a look at why the other 2 fail. So if we go king e4, knight c5 would be forking the rook and we lose. What about the other one? King to g4 runs into knight e5 check. And again, we get forked and lose. So for that reason, king g5 is the only thing which keeps our advantage. But keep in mind this very simple tip. If your king is on a dark square, rook on the light square, and vice versa, you can never get forked by a knight. Second example of the same pattern, we get knight e2 check. What are our options? We have this, this, and this. Our queen is on a light square, which means we should go to a dark one. This way, we can never get forked. The other 2 get forked by knight to d4. So we save ourselves the queen and the game. And the last example, we have this one where we have a bishop instead. Same story. After knight e3 check, you have 3 options, but you have to go to a light square because your bishop is on a dark one. So if you go to either one of these 2, you get hit by knight c4, forking your bishop. The second pattern you must know is avoiding knight checks altogether. How do we avoid knight checks? By placing our king in a certain position as opposed to the knight, relative to the knight. So let's take a look at how that works. Right now, we have an endgame where we have 4 king moves and we're trying to promote our pawn. If we make the right king move, we will hide from the knight long enough for our pawn to reach the other side. So this is very important for these knight versus pawn endgames, but generally it's a very useful tip, even if you're in the middle game, even if you're in a different type of endgame. How do you hide from the knight? Well, in order to see that, we're just going to move the kings away, just to, again, understand how the knight works as a piece. So I'm going to draw a graph, which I would like you to screenshot at the end. I will tell you when to. So let's see how many squares it takes the knight to give a check to its surrounding positions. So I'm going to draw some lines here. Currently, it's giving check to these squares. So this will take 0 moves to give a check to. It will take 1 move to get to these squares. We could double check quickly. So like this would give check to this square. This would give check to this square. And all of those are symmetrical. So if it's in a straight line 2 squares away, then the check is like this. If it's diagonally 1 square away, then there's still a check in 1 move. There could be a check in 2 moves if your king is on one of these squares, the blue ones. In that case, the route would look something like this. Here and here would give a check to this square, for example. All the routes are the same in terms of distance. So for example, if I wanted to check this square, I could do it like this. I could do it like this. I could do it like this. A lot of different ways. Let me just delete some of those. So the blue ones are the second best place to hide the king, and the absolute best place to hide the king are these ones, the yellow ones, because they are 2 squares away diagonally. It takes the knight a surprising 3 moves to give a check in the shortest route. Let's take a look. So let's take this one, for example. 1, 2, 3. That will give a check to this square. Let's try with this one. 1, 2, 3. Again, doesn't matter which route you take. There's a lot of them, but 3 moves is the minimum. So that's why in the initial position, by the way, screenshot this quickly, pause the video and screenshot. That's why in the initial position here, we're wanting to go to this square because that's 2 squares away diagonally. Of course, you can expand and look at how many checks it takes the knight for these further away squares, but just to have a good sense of like a box around him, you have the graph now, which tells you how to hide from the knight properly, because the knight moves in an L shape, so it's a little bit weird. So king to b3 here is the only winning move. Everything else leads to a drawn endgame. To prove it quickly, if we go, let's go one by one. So if here, then already there is the draw of king d2. If we take this one, they just go here and it's a corner pawn draw. If they go here, now we could just get knight b4 in, and wherever they go, we will stay on this route, and there's no way that black does something about that to get us away from that route. So if they attack our knight, we go here. If they push the pawn, knight c1 is a fork. If they don't, then we just keep going here or here. They have to let one of those go. If they go here, we go back. If they go here, we go here. And we're just spinning around in this famous knight route. And the lone king cannot do anything. Even if our king wasn't here, this would still be a draw. So that's why king to b3 is the only victory for black, because now these two are basically pre-moves, and there is nothing that white can do. So that's how we avoid knight checks. Try to get two squares diagonally from the knight. If you cannot, then right next to the knight in a straight line is the second best thing. Let's see another example. In this position, so they gave us a check from somewhere, and we have a lot of king moves, but only one of them wins the game. Everything else leads to a draw because they catch our pawn before it queens. So you know by now that it's this square, two squares diagonally from the knight. That hides the best. If we go somewhere else, let's say that we come here to try and get to our pawn and support it, that's the wrong way to go about this, because now they can utilize a check in order to catch our pawn. So let's say they go knight e6, we go g2, they just go knight d4, and this forces us to make a king move because it's check, and wherever we go, they're going to go here and catch the pawn in time before we queen. So that's how they give us a check if we go here. If we go here, immediate fork. If we go here, then they give a check and bounce off to this square. As soon as they touch the square in front of our pawn, that's an immediate draw. So that's why the only square is to go here. You can check the other lines for yourself if you like, but king a3 is the only draw, is the only win, sorry. So for that reason, we have another example. In this particular example, now we can't go diagonally two squares away because that would be a square above this one, which doesn't exist. But the second best place is right next to the knight, so right here. And this, again, is the only victory. So it's not going to be very common that you find yourself in a pawn versus knight endgame, but this can also be applied to other endgames where you just want to hide from the knight to not have to worry about those checks. Especially when you're in time trouble, the last thing you want to do is get checked multiple times by a knight, because there's always going to be some sort of jumping off point to get to somewhere else and win material. So for that reason, minimize the knight checks. That's how you do it. And the last pattern you must know to never get tricked by a knight again is simply to dominate the knight. What does it mean to dominate the knight? To take away all of its squares. So bishops do this extremely well. Bishop to d5 would dominate the knight, as in take away all of the knight's squares. So now wherever the knight goes, it simply gets captured. This allows us to simply push this pawn completely uncontested to the other side. And their king is also too far away to do anything, so white wins very smoothly here. Now, dominating a knight could be done with a bishop, and usually it's done with a bishop, 3 squares away, like this. But it could also be done by pawns, as we're going to see in our second example here. This is a theory example, just to show you that this is not applicable only to endgames, everything that I'm teaching you here as patterns. This can also be done in openings, in middle games, in various situations. So the theory example comes from the Scotch game, something that I personally play as white, and it's this knight f6 main variation. In this position, when we take this one, black could go b takes or d takes. And d takes is considered a slight inaccuracy because we get to trade queens and play not e5, because that would go run into knight g4 and all sorts of complications, but now we get to see what I was talking about earlier, f3. What does f3 do? It dominates the knight. So this is a very important pattern for middle games. When you place a pawn on f3 or c3 against a knight on f6 or c6, you take away its aggressive squares, not allowing it to cause any damage at all. Combined with another pawn like this, it takes away 3 of the knight's squares. So this knight on f6 is on the verge of useless. It can only go to h5, but when it goes to h5, we're just going to play g3 once again. And now these pawns do the same thing. They dominate the knight. So this poor knight can actually not do much. Whereas if we went e5 here, trying to like attack the knight would go to g4 and attack this pawn, attack this pawn. Currently, the only one under threat is this one. Since this one is defended, this one is defended. So we go, let's say, f4, but now they go bishop c5. And now these squares are defended. We're in a lot of trouble here. For that reason, when you're in a middle game, one of the best ways to use your bishops and pawns is to pay attention to the knight and dominate it before it causes any damage. So here, pawn to f3 is by far the best move and the easiest to play as well. From here, we're literally just going to develop our pieces in the most normal, natural way and gain an advantage. One small thing, just so you don't apply this out of context, in this position, pawn to f3 is the best move, but it's very rarely the best move. You can't just play it every time there's a knight on f6. The key things to pay attention to are, before you play this move, double check if your opponent has a queen that can come to h4 and cause a lot of damage, and double check that you don't have a knight on g1, which is now blocked as a result of this. So make sure to play every move with a purpose and look at the downsides of each move. Don't just blindly apply patterns. You have to apply them within the context. Be careful. To put a recap to everything that we learned today, we learned the pattern number 1, avoiding knight forks. When you have a king and a rook or a king and a queen, the way you get knight forked is by putting those on the same color squares. So if you can help it, try to go to the opposite color. If your rook is on a light square, go to a dark square. If your rook is on a dark square, go to a light square. Pattern number 2 was how to avoid knight checks altogether, to minimize the amount of checks given by a knight, or to, in other words, to maximize the duration it takes a knight to get to your king and deliver a check. We had that graph where essentially we said go 2 squares away diagonally as the best position to hide from a knight, and the second best position is right next to it. So the green ones are the best, the red ones are the second best if the first best is not available. That's how you hide from checks altogether and minimize them. And the third pattern was simply to dominate a knight whenever possible. So use your bishop or pawns in order to take away squares from the knight. So instead of dealing with it, you could stop it altogether.
And there is one more pattern that I just remembered while editing the video, and it's to use your rook in the same square that you would hide your king from the knight. This one, 2 squares away diagonally. When you use a rook in this fashion, it dominates the knight's squares perfectly, allowing you to either promote a pawn uncontested or just generally do not have to worry about any aggressive knight moves. In fact, here is my position from the European University Championship, where I played against an intermaster here as white, and I'm pushing for the win with my outside pass pawn, but my king's a little bit in trouble, and it was noticed by the intermaster that knight c6 taking advantage of the pin didn't really amount to much because I trade rooks, so for that reason he played knight e6 in time trouble. I'm at 20 seconds, he's at 22 seconds, and I don't know where to go with my rook. Where do I go? Rook c8. Why? Because now I don't have to worry about the knight anymore, and soon after I managed to promote quite smoothly.
Congratulations! Now you know what it takes to beat those tricky knights and neutralize them once and for all. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like below to let me know, comment with any questions you might have, and if you enjoy the idea of chess improvement in general, consider subscribing on my channel to get notified when I post a new video. Thank you very much for watching, and take it easy.